All right, so we're going to talk about economic policy for a few minutes, and you've got the PowerPoints available to you, and I'm going to be looking over to your, well, I'm going to be looking over this way uh, from time to time to look at the slides, and quickly trying to get through this. I don't want to keep you on too long. One of the things that you have to think about in terms of economic policy is what things factor into the government making decisions about economic policy. We can start with the question, should the government even be involved in the economy? And the answer in short terms for the United States has been the last probably 100 years or so, yes, the government does have a place in messing around with the economy. Prior to that time, the answer was pretty much no. And to give you a very brief history of economics, what was classically called liberal economics, ironically, given our term liberal and what we call liberal and conservative, liberal economists back in up through the late 1800s, we'll say, into the early 1900s, liberal economists were those who thought that the economy should be left alone and that the government ought not to involve itself in any significant way in the economy. In other words, the economy was just to be allowed to run on its own, and capitalism was to be allowed to run on its own. Towards the latter part of the 19th century, the late 1800s, and into the early 1900s, the United States started passing antitrust laws and so forth because some of the companies back then had gotten enormously large, much like we would say Microsoft, Amazon, and so forth, Google. Those kind of companies are starting to get to the point where they get exceedingly large and awfully powerful. To give you an example, one of the great business people, I guess great is a strange, maybe an unusual word, but one of the most successful business people back at that time, and we're talking about the turn of the century from the 1800s to the 1900s, was a guy named Andrew Carnegie. Well worth looking into his biography if you ever get a chance. Another one was a guy named John Rockefeller, and there was a third guy named John Pierpont Morgan, often known as J.P. Morgan. These three men were the sort of captains of industry, all worth billions of dollars when long before being a billionaire was understood in our common vernacular. These men probably had worth that would now exceed anything any of the richest men in the world now have. Jeff Bezos would be a pipsqueak compared to Andrew Carnegie, for instance. Andrew Carnegie, at one point, it was believed to be worth $3 billion back. Now, we're talking 120 years ago. And so you can imagine what that would be in today's terms. So since that time, the United States government started interjecting itself into the economy to some extent, and that became more and more prevalent, particularly after World War I. The Federal Reserve System was created in the early 1900s. To manage the flow of money. There's an awful lot of conspiracy theories about that. We won't get into those, and you don't have to worry about that. But in any event, after the Great Depression, obviously, the government entered the economy in an enormous way. And since that time, the government has found itself interjecting itself into the economy in a variety of ways, not the least of which are taxes, of course, which is always an intervention into the economy, but also things like, monetary policy, also borrowing. And the government borrows a lot of money, and you may have heard about that. And so the government has gotten involved in spending and using the power of the government, the power of the purse, to try to influence the economy in ways to keep it from having big highs and big lows. And so that's kind of what you will kind of what's going on. So the first slide you're going to look at, and we're just going to go through these quickly, was year-over-year changes in the U.S. national debt, and I'm showing you that only as a matter of you looking at that and realizing that our country has an enormous national debt, but it goes up and it goes down, and it's kind of gotten significantly larger over the last 10 to 15 years. For the longest time, in fact, in the around 2000, the national debt was just a trifle over $17 billion. It's now at the $1.8 trillion mark, $1 trillion mark, and so it's a little higher now because the numbers you're looking at are a little old. So it's really got large. Now, part of what happened was 9/11, and the national debt skyrocketed after 9/11, and again, in part because that just really put an enormous clamp on the economy, and all kinds of things were done to try to get the government involved to make the economy work, and so a lot of that involved borrowing money in order to put it into the economy in an effort to try to get things moving. As we go along, the national debt as a percentage of GDP, you'll hear people talk about that it's unsustainable when you get to a certain point. Currently, we're right around 50% of GDP, and my understanding is that if it goes to 60% or larger, then that really creates problems, or at least supposedly. I suppose that's the case. I'm not a well-trained economist. I do have a degree in economics as a bachelor's degree, but I can't begin to tell you whether that's true or not. What I can tell you is this, is that if you look at the chart that I've provided, what you see is that the national debt as a percentage of gross domestic product was at one point 120%. Okay, and so it can be said that isn't necessarily a death knell for the United States economy. So again, it fluctuates. It's been rather high the past 20 or so years. It's gone up since the early 1980s, higher and higher, but has leveled off the last probably 10 or 12 years. So what that means is hard to say. People get wound up about it. But again, that's something that over time has kind of drifted up, but not at an exponential rate, or at a rate, the economy has gotten a lot larger and a lot larger and a lot larger, and presumably that would mean the national debt can be sustained. It has so far. Eventually, you have to pay your bills. But one of the things you'll hear economists talk about is the fact that it's not the same thing when you're talking about the government paying debt as it is an individual paying debt. And so it's not a one-to-one correspondence. And so you can't make exactly the same kind of thing, calculations, nor can you make the same kind of statements. People will often say, well, I can't live that way. I can't keep borrowing. Well, no, you can't. You're not the government. But people do often borrow and sometimes get into serious problems with debt. And yet, oftentimes, people, without going bankrupt and without everything falling apart, actually manage to crawl out and pay their debts. And so it's not a great thing, don't get me wrong, but it may not be the terrible thing that people suggest it is. Gross domestic product is the GDP. You'll hear that term used. That is the basic measure of our society's productivity in goods and services. Gross meaning before just the gross product. So for instance, let me put it in simple terms. You have a lemonade stand, you sell lemonade. In one summer day, you sell 100 glasses of lemonade for $2 each. Your gross product that day is $200. That's your gross product. But you have to factor in, how much did it cost to make the lemonade? How much did it cost for the cups? Did you buy ice? Did you pay somebody to sit there at the lemonade stand? Okay, and those kind of things. So the gross is just the sheer volume. That's before expenses and taxes and all those kinds of things. Over the years, the gross domestic product of the United States, even since the 90s, has been going up, 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 up. It had a little bit of a turn down after 2008, after a bit of a recession, but it picked back up since then. So the United States economy has generally been growing over the years and is now continuing to grow. And is generally, it's the largest economy in the world, as we're going to see in the next slide. The 2019 forecast shows the United States economy at approximately $21 trillion gross domestic, the Chinese economy 14 trillion, and then it drops off significantly from there. We're the two, that's 50% of the world's economy between the United States and China. Now, just as a current events note, given the coronavirus and all that's going on, and me doing this and you being at home and hopefully watching this and taking a couple notes, because these things might pop up on the quiz, right? And you're so look, that maybe the Chinese did this on purpose, maybe they didn't. I know there's all kinds of conspiracy theories going on, but it would be an odd thing for the Chinese to sort of really, kind of cut their own economic throat, as it were, by damaging the United States just for the sheer fun of it, and just to say, oh, we're going to take over. Because if the United States economy blows a gasket, then the Chinese economy is also going to blow a gasket. It doesn't help the Chinese to damage us economically like that. So it's kind of a weird thing to make that argument. But maybe they are. Maybe they don't care. I don't know. In any event, we'll move on. We'll move on. So world GDP in 1991, I just want to mention this for just a minute, because I want you to realize this, that China's nowhere to be seen in 1991 in the world economy. The United States, of course, was still the largest, and in fact, going back historically, I want to say since about 1960, the United States has had the largest economy in the world, and it may even go before that. I don't remember exactly, but I know it's gone back 50 plus years, and I think even further back than that, even into the 1950s, that the United States economy has been the largest by far, and it's always been the largest by far since that time. That doesn't mean we can't be overtaken, but just the nature of the freedoms that we have in this country makes it interesting that that our economy continues on versus other economies that don't have all the freedoms we have. And it does say something about the nature of the capitalistic society. And I know that's not popular these days, but there is something to be said for allowing people some measure of freedom, and as much as is reasonable, perhaps. And I know Bernie Sanders would argue against that, but maybe Bernie's got it wrong. In any event, you don't see, look, the Soviet Union had a large economy and was second to ours for a number of years, but then it just died, and of course it fell apart. The whole country fell apart, and the whole quote-unquote union fell apart and became disunionized, disunioned, I don't know what words you want to use, but it fell apart, and part of the reason was there's no freedom. And interestingly enough, Russia and many of the satellite states, that has really helped them to spur them to become something a bit different. Not all good necessarily, but still better than it was. You'll see that the countries with the largest GDPs are the countries, relatively speaking, that have the most freedom to do what people want to do. That does spur ingenuity and so forth. And so there's something to be said for that. My friend Skippy keeps hearing about gross domestic product, and he says it sounds like something from a horror movie, but really it's the total value of goods produced and services provided in a country during 1 year. And I've already gone through that and described that, so we'll move on. I want to talk about some economists here, because these are key economists over the last 75 years, very important people who had an impact on the United States economy because they had the ear of people who were important. John Maynard Keynes, the father of what is known as Keynesian economics, believed in government intrusion into the economy in the short run. In other words, he thought the government should interject money, mess around with interest rates in the short run. And as Keynes famously said, in the long run, we're all dead. That was in response to economists who would often say, well, in the long run, these things will work themselves out. And Keynes said, well, yeah, you're right, but in the long run, we're all dead. Let's deal with the short run. And so Keynes's idea was that the government ought to move in and then move back out in times of trouble. Not that the government should have an overarching presence in the economy, but that it ought to do things, and it ought to act judiciously. Another figure in that realm is a guy named John Kenneth Galbraith. He did not defend, and Keynes, by the way, was a defender of the free market. I mean, for the most part, he wasn't a communist. He wasn't a socialist. He was a free market guy who just thought we ought to tweak things from time to time. The government ought to use its power to keep things from going nuts. Galbraith, John Kenneth Galbraith, who was another very significant thinker in the economic world. Both these guys, by the way, were British. Keynes and Galbraith, both British guys, had the ear of many important and influential government figures. Galbraith took Keynesian economics to the next level, if you want to call it that. He thought government price controls were a good idea, and also thought the government should maintain a major role in economic policy. Galbraith, and you'll see a couple of the quotes on the slides, he was rather glib, would be the word I would use. And so he was able to catch people's attention with some of the things he said. But he was really much more into government intervening in the economy on a routine and regular basis. A third person we're going to talk about is a guy named Milton Friedman. Now, we're going to have our boy Galbraith over here on one end, and we're going to have, you can see my hands, we're going to have Galbraith on this end. It's weird when you're looking at yourself, by the way, on a video and doing it. Everything's backwards. So we're going to have Galbraith over here, and we're going to have Friedman over here, and then we're going to have our fella Keynes in the middle. Okay, that's kind of what we're doing. Milton Friedman was a late 20th century economist, very, very famous, very well known, and you'll see the slides, so I won't repeat what's on all the slides. But basically, Friedman's idea was the government ought to stay out of the economy as much as is humanly possible, and in fact, really ought to just stay out of the economy. And he was I guess you would refer to him as basically libertarian. He was much more of what I referred to at the very beginning as a liberal economist. He believed in letting free markets do what they were going to do. And so he thought that was the best way to handle things and to deal with economic matters. One of the last slides you'll have is the Laffer curve. There's a couple more, but I'm going to talk about the Laffer curve for a minute. This was popularized by Ronald Reagan, and the economist who created it, his point was this, that you can't just tax and tax and tax and tax, because there comes a point at which the tax rate will be too high, and that you'll start to have diminishing returns on tax revenue. In other words, if you tax people too much, they'll find ways to avoid paying taxes, or they'll just stop producing because they don't want to get taxed anymore. Think of it this way, and and I'm going to give you a simple version of the Laffer curve. So let's go back to your lemonade stand there, okay? The lemonade stand makes $200, but for every $200 that you make, or let's say for every 100, all right, for every $100 you make, every gross $100, right, you haven't paid anything else yet, the government says you got to give us $10. And so you say, okay, I can live with that. And so you make $100, you give the government 10, you have 90 left, you pay whatever you pay for supplies, let's say 20, and now you pay somebody, $15 to help you. And so you've now spent $30, $45, and you have a $55 profit, okay? And you're happy with that. Okay, you make the next 100. The government says, give us our 10. You go, okay, fine, 10, all right? Now let's say, though, the government comes in and says, we want more. And so the government says, we're going to take $20 now. And you say, okay, I'm still going to make a profit of $45. The government's just taking an extra 10, so I'll keep producing. Right? I can live with that. But here's the thing. The government then comes back and says, well, we now need 30 for every $100 over a certain amount. And so you start calculating and thinking, now I'm only going to make $35 on the first, and if the government says, well, on the first 100 we'll take 10, on the second 100 we'll take 20, on the third 100 we'll take 30, on the fourth 100 we'll take 40, you see where this is going. At some point, all other things equal, in other words, your costs remain the same for producing, the cost of the lemonade, the cost of the sugar, the cost of the cups, the cost of the labor to sit there and help you sell the lemonade. If those things all remain equal and the tax keeps going up, at some point you're going to just not make any more lemonade because you're going to reach a point where it's not productive. And that's the point of the Laffer curve, is that you just can't tax people. And so now I bring this up because, again, we have Bernie Sanders, presidential candidate, who runs again and again and again with this mantra that, well, we just need to tax rich people. Well, that sounds good in theory, but the problem is this Laffer curve is going to create difficulties for that. And so you can't just tax people out. You will force them to stop producing, is what it boils down to, at least according to the Laffer curve, if you believe it. Now, some people just say it's voodoo economics and so forth, but it makes a lot of sense. Producers of goods and services have incentives, and when those incentives start causing them to lose money, they will stop producing. There's no reason for them to. If you get to the point where the government is taking more than it's worth doing, then you'll just say, yeah, I'm not going to do anymore. I don't need it. There's no need for it. So finally, you've got one last slide here that you'll need to take a look at, and that is the supply and demand slide. Now, I've shown you these early on in the class. You've probably forgotten. But this is a basic supply and demand curve, as is called, and it shows you what is referred to as the market clearing price and quantity. Now, price is the vertical axis, and demand is the horizontal axis. And the vertical axis shows how much the price of a good is. Now, notice the higher the demand, okay, and remember, demand, the higher on the horizontal axis there shows us how much stuff is being produced. When you get to where they come together, there's zero produced, so that point there where it's like this, right? There's nothing produced and there's no price. The price is zero and the output is zero. At the price zero, no one is willing to produce goods and services because no one's going to do that. They're simply not going to take zero for what they've produced. They're just going to say, no, I'm just not going to do it. In other words, this is the mantra that you'll hear economists say: there's no such thing as a free lunch. Okay, and that's what they mean by that. Nobody produces for nothing. They've got to get some return for their production. Well, what this very basic economic graph, and this is something that if you take economics, any kind of economics course, if you take an economics course in college, if you're going to college, this is the kind of thing that you'll see right at the very beginning. Okay, and it'll show you this basic price, basic supply and demand curves. Now notice that the demand of things goes way up as the price falls. Now that shouldn't shock you. In other words, consumers of whatever good it is, economists often will refer to this as a widget, which is a made-up thing that economists use as their go-to product. So if we're talking about widgets, right, the more widgets that are produced, or the more that, the lower the more the output, and the lower the price, the higher the demand. That's the blue curve. The problem is, and the problem for suppliers is, they want a higher price. The higher the price goes up, the more they want to produce. Okay, and so the difficulty is that, and you can see that there comes a point at which those two lines intersect. In other words, the supply and demand meet, and that's referred to as the market clearing price and the market clearing output. In other words, there's the idea is, in theory, there's a general movement along those two curves which creates this outcome. Is it perfect? No. Does it work every single time? No, not exactly. It does not, unless we don't need to pretend it does. However, uh, what you will find is that this does have an impact on things, okay? If somebody's able to produce a product for less money, for instance, let's say it costs them less in terms of the goods and the labor for some reason. Somebody, I don't know, they outsource their labor to China and they pay $1 an hour instead of paying someone in the United States $22 an hour. Do you know any companies that do stuff like that, that outsource to China? Apple, for instance. Okay, so instead of your iPhone costing $2,000, it's $1,000. Well, yay, right? I mean, it's still a lot of money. But demand for the iPhone is going to go up if it costs less. And Apple will produce as many as they can to satisfy the market. And so that things bump around, okay, and so it never is static. And so when you see the supply and demand curve, that's really just a moment in time. It's a picture. Those curves move around to some extent, and so it's never exactly looking just like that all the time. It's not like you just get there and then go, oh well, that's it, no more iPhones, no more demand for iPhones, right? It doesn't work quite that way. So this picture shows us kind of a snapshot of what a market might look like at any given moment. Here's the point though. As a basic rule, these things tend to be true. Okay? The lower the price, the more the demand. The higher the price, the more the supply. Suppliers like to supply things at a higher price. Consumers like to buy things at a lower price. Now, one other thing I'm going to mention, and I think I've already talked to you about this way back when, but I'm going to mention it again. It's not on any of the graphs I'm showing you today. One of the difficulties with, for instance, a minimum wage is that it fixes a floor. Okay, so if this curve, if this graph you're looking at, right, is where it's at, and let's say that's the price for fast food workers. And in the local economy. So in Louisville, Kentucky, let's say the price for a fast food worker is $11.75 an hour. I don't know, but let's just make that up. Okay? And that clears out the market. In other words, everyone in Louisville, Kentucky who wants to work at a fast food joint and wants to get paid $11.75 is out there and is working. And so fast food places in Louisville are getting employees in at $11.75 an hour. I don't even, like I said, I'm making this up. And they've got all the workers they need, and all the people who want to work for $11.75 an hour at fast food joints are all employed. That's what this snapshot would show us at any given time. So Bernie Sanders comes along and says, no, you have to make $15 an hour. Well, then here's the problem. Just propping the price up like that is artificial, and it creates a floor above the market clearing price. Here's the problem. There's more supply of labor at 15 than there is demand. Demand goes down at the higher price. Look at the graph. The higher the price, the less demand there is. Okay, so buyers of employees, right? Buyers of services buy less of that at $15 an hour. It creates a gap between the people who want to work and the people who are willing to pay for the work. And in fact, ironically, reduces employment. Now, that's a very simplistic view, but in general terms, on a very general basis, that's kind of the problem. And so it does create those sort of difficulties for us. All right, I'm going to stop there on economic policy. I went 29 minutes, so that really was a very quick run through of this. Read chapter 17, be prepared to answer some questions from this lecture, and look at the slides. And so it's going to be a little more intensive on the quizzes, given that we're not in class and I can't get the back and forth that I might have gotten from you. So if you have questions, email me, and I will get those to you. I've also, I think I sent a last email. I sent my phone number. Don't be afraid to text me with questions. I prefer text because it's easier for me to respond. If you call me, there's lots of times during the day when I can't answer because I'm otherwise occupied. But if you text me, it's a little easier for me to get to you. So text me or email me if you'd like.